Habermas's Critique of the Production Paradigm by Ingo Elbe. Jürgen Habermas's project of a reformulation of critical theory was from the very beginning characterized by a confrontation with Marx and the Marxist tradition. In particular, their concepts of labor, production, and social synthesis repeatedly gained Habermas's attention and became objects of his critique. The rejection of what later came to be called the, quote, production paradigm, end quote, occurred at three levels. In terms of social theory, Habermas doubts that a sufficient concept of social unity can be obtained through the concept of labor. In terms of social philosophy, Habermas complains about the meager normative potential of the concept of labor, and sociologically, the relevance of labor as a leading category in the epoch of late capitalism is called into question. In the following, I wish to concentrate upon the dimension of social theory. Since knowledge and human interest, and culminating in his critique of the production paradigm and the philosophical discourse of modernity, Habermas attributes to Marx a model of social synthesis through, quote, labor. Habermas's critique is that the limitation of the concept of praxis to labor in the sense of the, quote, making of products, end quote, or the, quote, metabolic process between society and nature, end quote, brings the problem of reducing, quote, rules of social interaction, end quote, to, quote, technical and utilitarian rules for production and employing products, end quote. If, however, Marxist theorists decide to distinguish between these dimensions, then according to Habermas, they necessarily depart from the categorical framework of the production paradigm. Thus, quote, labor, end quote, for Habermas can only be understood according to the model of a non-social, technical, manipulative relationship to an object. Accordingly, quote, the production paradigm is fit solely for the explanation of labor and not for that of interaction, end quote, i.e. praxis in this sense, quote, has structure-forming effects only for the metabolic process between human beings and nature, end quote. In contrast, according to Habermas's two-leveled concept, society appears, quote, on the one hand as a process of production and appropriation, which proceeds in accord with technical utilitarian rules and signals the relevant level of exchange between society and nature, that is, the state of the forces of production, and on the other hand, as a process of interaction which is regulated by social norms and brings about a selective access to power and wealth, that is, expresses the relations of production, end quote, Habermas. That, quote, practice in the sense of norm-governed interaction cannot be analyzed on the model of the productive expenditure of labor power and the consumption of use values. That, quote, practice in the sense of norm-governed interaction cannot be analyzed on the model of the productive expenditure of labor power and the consumption of use values, end quote, is an understandable statement. However, the question arises as to whether such a reductionism is actually developed in Marx's critique of political economy. In the following, I will demonstrate that Habermas, through his approach to Marx, which proceeds on the basis of Marx's early writings, does not perceive changes to social theoretical categories in the course of the development of Marx's work. This applies above all to the form analytical distinction between abstract and concrete labor, which is first fully developed in Capital. The core problem of Habermas's social theory will prove to be that with the replacement of the concept of, quote, relations of production, end quote, through that of the, quote, institutional framework, end quote, or, quote, interaction, end quote, on one hand, and the, quote, subsystem of rational purposive behavior, end quote, on the other, the innovative content of the critique of political economy's concept of society is missed, thus transforming social theory into an external combination of symbolic interactionist reductionism and systems theoretical affirmation of social alienation. Society is dissolved into the dualisms of labor and interaction, technics and ethics, human being thing, human being relations. Habermas thereby consummates a separation of the class relation from the class relation's objective mediation, i.e., from the class relation's economic character in the narrow sense, and also trivializes autonomous economic mechanisms to media of communication that disburden activity with the goal of augmenting nature and in optimal material reproduction. Synthesis through labor. In Knowledge and Human Interest, in establishing the foundation of the critique of the production paradigm, Habermas makes use of the procedure of assembling this paradigm from text passages from Marx's work, in which, as in the early writings, there is not yet the concept of the critique of political economy, and hence no concept of the double character of labor has yet been developed by Marx, and in which, as in the 7th chapter of Capital, avowedly transhistorical expositions of the labor process are conducted in conscious abstraction from the specific relations of production. That results in the following picture of a materialist conception of labor. Quote, labor has the function of synthesis, end quote, which is understood as a process of constitution of the human species through interaction with nature. In such a concept, the synthesis, quote, through labor, the synthesis through, quote, labor, end quote, in the sense of a concrete labor in general, or as Habermas says, a, quote, behavioral system of instrumental action, end quote. The constitution of the species is, however, conceptualized in a reductive manner. Quote, through the labor process, end quote, according to Habermas's presentation, quote, what changes is not only the nature that has been worked on, but by means of products of labor, the necessitous nature of the labor subjects themselves, end quote. The rules of this synthesis are ultimately supposed to become, quote, objectified as productive forces, end quote. The, quote, identity of social subjects alters with the scope of their power of technical control, end quote. The process of social evolution is thus understood as a monological dialectic of, quote, human beings, end quote, nature, end quote, in the labor process. In order to draw this picture of materialist synthesis, Habermas must not only disregard the concept of social form, which is fundamental for the mature Marx, but also the insight into the primacy of relations of production over the forces of production in Marx's late works. Under, quote, form, end quote, Habermas understands merely the change in, quote, natural form, end quote, of objects in the process of concrete labor, meaning the transformation of nature according to human purposes in the labor process. Marx thus quoted, quote, in his production, man can only proceed like nature herself, that is, only by changing the forms of substances, end quote. However, after this statement by Marx about labor as a process of the production of use values, this sentence follows, quote, let us now pass from the commodity as an object of utility to the value of commodities, end quote. Habermas does not go along with this step, thus he summarizes the concept of the synthesis through labor as, quote, the synthesis of the material of labor by labor power, end quote, which, quote, receives its actual unity through categories of man's manipulations, end quote. Through labor, then, a unity of, quote, man and nature, end quote, is created, quote, that binds the objectivity of the possible objects of experience to the objective activity of subjects on the one hand, but does not eliminate the independence of its existence on the other, end quote. Whereby one can only speak of the social subject, quote, in the singular, end quote, to the extent that it is, quote, the level of development of the forces of production, end quote, that, quote, determines the system of social labor as a whole, end quote. Production is supposed to be nothing other than, quote, sensuous labor and creation, end quote. the, quote, tangible productive activity of the species, end quote. The process of the self-constitution of the species thus imputed is, according to Habermas, identified by Marx, quote, with the appropriation of essential powers that have been externalized in working on material, end quote. Since, according to Habermas, Marx, quote, conceives of reflection according to the model of production, end quote, he misses the epistemological status of the social sciences and understands, quote, economics as a, quote, human natural science, end quote. With his talk of laws of movement of the capitalist mode of production, Marx conceives of the logic of social development as a, quote, natural law, end quote. According to Habermas, he thus orients towards the scientistic zeitgeist and suppresses the reflective specificity of critique, which relates to its object not as a registry apparatus, but rather means to recover it in a self-determined way. Against this reading, the following indication must suffice. Marx's critique of economics must be understood as a materialism of second nature, in two regards. First, as a theory of the real act of autonomization and objectification of the relations of production. When Marx thus claims to grasp the dynamic of the capitalist mode of production, quote, as a process of natural history, end quote, it must be noted that nature or naturalness is a negatively determined category. Under historically specific conditions, the social relations between human beings take the form of an actual social relationship between things, which is largely beyond the control of human beings. Second, Marx's critique of economics is a critique of the objective appearance, the false naturalization of social relations within the capitalist mode of production. Marx thus opposes naturalistic, anthropological, and empiricist conceptualizations of the field of political economy and attempts at the same time to explain these as arising from the forms of capitalist everyday life. Thus referring to a theory that explains that its objects, the forms of wealth specific to capitalism, do not contain, quote, an atom of matter, end quote, as a, quote, natural science, end quote, as Habermas does, is more than astonishing. The substitution of personal for anonymous domination. However, Habermas is also forced to state that in his materialist investigations, Marx in no way identifies, quote, the self-conscious control of the social life process, end quote, with, quote, an automatic regulation of the process of production, end quote. But this difference points to the distinction between monological relations of labor on one hand and intersubjective relations of force, or respectively of recognition, on the other hand. The accusation, as is already known, is that the insufficiency of the concept of a social synthesis by means of labor, which contains an impermissible, quote, reduction of the self-generative act of the human species to labor, end quote. The concept thus requires supplementation by a, quote, synthesis through struggle, end quote, understood as a, quote, symbolic interaction, end quote, in a, quote, institutional framework, end quote, which is here still borrowed from the Hegelian dialectic of the morality of criminal and commonwealth. According to Habermas, Marx in fact reflects this framework, but conceptually misses this dimension of human activity. Thus, quote, revolutionary practice remains displaced in the, quote, more restricted conception of the species, self-reflection through work alone, end quote. Quote, synthesis through social labor, end quote, according to Habermas, quote, mediates the social subject with external nature as its object, But this process of mediation is interlocked with synthesis through struggle, end quote, which Marx understands as, quote, a relation of social force, namely the power of one social class over another, end quote. This relation of force is grounded in and, quote, economically defined through the free labor contract as a form of civil law, end quote, which in turn is nothing other than a, quote, distortion of a dialogic relation, end quote, between human beings, which represents a, quote, causality of split-off symbols and reified grammatical relations, end quote. It's no wonder, then, that in his early work, Habermas identifies, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, with, quote, the critical abolition of ideologies, end quote, through, quote, reflection, end quote, and interprets emancipation from alienated forms in terms analogous to psychoanalysis, modified by communication theory in the spirit of the characterization of value as, quote, holding sway in reality itself, end quote, objective, quote, conceptuality, end quote, as, quote, illusion, end quote, and as a, quote, mental configuration, end quote. By Adorno, Habermas grasped the forms of wealth as a, quote, objective illusion, end quote. Quote, the commodity form of labor, end quote, Habermas asserts, quote, is ideology because it simultaneously conceals and expresses the suppression of an unconstrained dialogic relation, end quote. But for Marx, the commodity form is in no way ideology, no objective form of thought or a dissociated linguistic symbol. Rather, on the basis of this real social relation, an ideological misrecognition of this social relation as the natural property of a thing is sparked. However, this renders understandable Habermas's later critique of Marx, in which he attributes to Marx the, in Habermas's opinion, untenable view that, quote, the systematic interconnection between an economy organized along capitalist lines and its governmental complement is a sheer illusion, which is supposed to melt away into nothing with the abolition of the relations of production, end quote. Or what Marx conceives of, quote, quote, an accumulation process that has broken away from orientations to use value, end quote, as, quote, literally amounting to an illusion, end quote, to a, quote, enchantment, end quote, even. This can be understood as a self-critique of Habermas's position in knowledge and human interest. The topos of the, quote, systemic as illusion, end quote, can, however, be translated into a non-Hegelian language, which will then make clear that Habermas, with his later critique, also sets his sights on the partially naive-seeming reduction of the emergence of social interrelations to alienation, which are found in isolated passages of the early writings of Marx and Engels and in critical theory. Thus, for example, Alfred Schmidt tends towards a methodological individualism within an emancipatory perspective, which proceeds from the assumption that social nominalism is the correct manner of description for communist societies. Quote, as soon as people cease to tolerate the objective domination of the universal, quote, nominalism, end quote, once again becomes valid. That is to say, a state of affairs is achieved in which the strange entities that human beings are at the mercy of disappear. The whole emerges from the planned and rational actions of individuals, end quote. Thus, the area of the mental cultural loses its, quote, superstructural character, end quote. However, Habermas goes far beyond a critique of such idealism and wishes to praise at the same time the, quote, evolutionarily advantageous level of integration, end quote, of autonomous forms such as state and capital, thus elevating a social democratic program for the protection of the life world to the level of critical social theory. Habermas then asserts, without empirical foundation, but merely out of the trivializing definitional orientation of his concepts of money and system, that a, quote, painless decoupling of the monetary bureaucratic complex, end quote, can be, quote, distinguished from the painful colonization of the life world, end quote. I will return to this. Quote, Marx, end quote, at least according to Habermas, quote, could have employed, end quote, Hegel's, quote, model and constructed the disproportional appropriation of the surplus product, which has class antagonism as its consequence, as a, quote, crime, end quote, end quote. But the model of a fractured moral totality refers, as Habermas emphasizes, to a, quote, institutional framework constructed out of cultural tradition, end quote. Habermas thus grasps forms of social intercourse as a praxis, quote, subject to norms that decide with the force of institutions how responsibilities and rewards, obligations and charges to the social budget are distributed among members, end quote. In the philosophical discourse of modernity, this is repeated within the context of an approving discussion of Georgi Marcus. Quote, norms of action ground differential rights and duties and secure motivations for the exercise of differentially distributed social roles, which in turn determine activities, skills, and the satisfaction of needs, end quote, as well as, quote, the distribution both of the means of production and of the wealth produced, end quote. Against this legal philosophical reductionism, it must be asserted that the private legal order mentioned by Habermas in connection with the institutional framework is the form of a non-juridical content, which in turn is an economic social form. Here, Marx identifies relationships of validation of an entirely different nature than those that can be identified at the level of consciousness, conscious, moral, juridical conflicts of recognition, and that is what is actually economic about his object. Habermas, on the other hand, constructs the following associative chain: legal, norm, institutional framework, class struggle, force. Thus, in Habermas's work, class relationships appear, as Klaus Ottomeyer notes, quote, as personal direct, end quote, precisely because Habermas ignores the specific synthesis through labor as Marx develops it on the basis of the commodity form. With regard to economic relations, Habermas only perceives the compulsorily reinforced mutual relation of wills of private dissociated legal subjects. The economic form, the objectively mediated unity of labors and products under the condition of their systematic dissociation, does not at all exist for him. It falls through between person-person interaction and person-thing relations, labor. The relation of property in Habermas's early work, the core of the normatively regulated institutional framework, is in contrast a circuit of reproduction that goes far beyond normatively regulated social constitution, and that begins historically with the violent separation of direct producers from their means of production and subsequently presents itself as the structural reproduction of this initial situation through the mediation of the exchange of equivalents and the implied relations of recognition between the subjects of exchange. Juridical relations of wills, social struggles, and state legal guarantees remain a constitutive element of modern property relations, but the latter cannot be reduced to them. Economic mediation, which in Habermas's work amounts to the legal dimension of the, quote, free labor contract, end quote, depends rather upon the value of relations as an exchange relation and its tendencies to become autonomous. This remains omitted in Habermas's perspective. According to Marx as well, there are no relations of property or exchange without law, synthesis of wills under the condition and with the consequence of their systematic dissociation into private isolated wills. But this is at the same time the implication of normatively uncontrolled, originally economic relations, synthesis of labors and products under the condition and with the consequence of their systematic dissociation into private, isolated acts of labor and products. Dieter Wolff thus correctly establishes that the consequence of Habermas's theoretical strategy is that, quote, the sociality of production addressed by the term, quote, institutionalized relations of force, end quote, has, quote, nothing to do with the sociality of production in its historically specific social form determination, end quote, which is why this relation of force, quote, without any consideration of production, end quote, appears modifiable, quote, within the framework of symbolic interaction, end quote. Quote, detached from production without possessing any historically specific form determination, the capital relation has been quietly transformed into a sort of institutionalized relation of force, end quote, which, like every other master-servant relationship, is one between the people, the specificity of which consists of being an interrelationship of symbolically mediated interaction, end quote, since time immemorial. Habermas thus also usually speaks of the appropriation of surplus product, actually a pre-capitalist form of exploitation, not a surplus value. The capitalist form mediated by exchange, which presupposes a synthesis through labor. To Habermas, the anonymous character of the social relation between producers of domination mediated by value appears to be merely personal domination disguised in an objective form, which is ultimately demonstrated by his concept of sanction. He distinguishes between two forms of sanction, namely punishment on the basis of conventional norms in the sense of a, quote, failure against authority, end quote, as well as a, quote, failure in reality, end quote, in the technical sense. The sanction that the market holds ready, however, consists neither of one nor the other form, but stands rather between material constraints that, quote, derive from the character of the material world and from the physical qualities of the body, end quote, and negative sanctions that are derived from, quote, from punitive responses on the part of some agents towards others, end quote. The sanction of the market is situated in social structural compulsions. Since the, quote, movement of the market, end quote, Ottomeyer maintains, quote, obey neither, quote, technical rules, end quote, nor norms, arising from a dialectic of recognition, unless one wishes to trace back the law of value, which imposes itself without regard for the intention of all participants to some sort of agreement between the subjects affected, end quote. Ottomeyer. Instead of understanding the reproduction of social groups mediated by the social relation between things in exchange, and the reproduction of autonomous economic forms and functions mediated in a class-specific way as a necessary interrelationship, Habermas divides them, whereas in the interactionist part of his theory, anonymous compulsions are reduced to personal compulsions. In the technicist, rather later systems theoretical part, domination is dissolved in terms of differentiation theory into inevitable practical constraints. Typical for this is also the statement of the aim of rationalization in, quote, systems of purposive rational action, end quote, as, quote, growth of productive forces, extension of power of technical control, end quote. Here, the economy also appears as an activity for increasing technical efficiency, not one for maximizing profit. That Habermas misses the point of the concept connected to the categories of abstract labor and value, of economic anonymous compulsions, can also be seen, finally, in his engagement with Peter Winch's conceptualization of the social in terms of language game theory. For Winch, quote, social relations between men and the ideas which men's actions embody are really the same things considered from different points of view, end quote. Social relations between people, quote, exist only through those ideas, and similarly, those ideas exist only in their relations to each other, end quote. Money, property, or economic transactions are also such ideas. Habermas had already criticized this idealism, among other things, in 1967. Thus he reasons, quote, the objectivity of a process of tradition that takes place in the medium of symbolic meaning is not objective enough, end quote. The, quote, meta-institution of language as tradition is dependent in turn on social processes that cannot be reduced to normative relationships, end quote. However, Habermas grasps the, quote, non-normative forces that enter into language as a meta-institution, end quote, merely as a direct, quote, force, end quote, on one hand, which is assigned to, quote, systems of domination, end quote, and as a, quote, constraint of external nature, end quote, on the other, which asserts itself in, quote, systems of labor, end quote. Again, the specific economic compulsion falls through the cracks of this anthropologizing interpretive grid. Now, the objection could be raised that at least in some passages, Habermas addresses the anonymous character of economic rule. In fact, one reads in Legitimation Crisis that, quote, the class relationship, end quote, according to Marx, quote, can assume the anonymous unpolitical form of wage dependency, end quote. Or in the Theory of Communicative Action, he mentions that Marx writes of a, quote, objectified anonymous process of exploitation, end quote. But here Habermas also remains within the personalizing paradigm of traditional Marxism. This anonymity is namely nothing other than the objective concealment of class relations and exploitation. Habermas is concerned solely with the, quote, power sanctioned in civil law, end quote, of, quote, the owners of the means of production, end quote, behind the, quote, objective shell, end quote. Thus, power also exists, but anonymous rule refers precisely to the autonomization of structural aspects of objectively mediated activity with regard to all actors. The domination of value as such, and of capital, not merely the concealed domination of the capitalists. Furthermore, Habermas uses this reference to Marx merely to distance himself from Marx's position. He mentions this coupling of not understood objectivity and domination merely in order to deny this coupling and emphasize the, quote, intrinsic evolutionary value, end quote, of autonomous subsystems, that is to say, in order to praise the supposed beneficial achievements for all of the state and capital. Norm-free regulation by means of the medium of money. In his later work, the technicist vocabulary with which Habermas characterizes the, quote, sphere of labor, end quote, is varied in a sense according to systems theory. Here we must mention above all else the concept of money as a symbolically generalized medium of communication with which Habermas seeks to describe the dimension of modern societies which cannot be grasped in an interactional manner. But the concept of medium is no substitute for the critique of political economy's concept of money and capital as social forms, since the concept of medium ignores the aspect of social domination, conceals the potential for crisis intrinsic to them, and simply cannot answer the question concerning the possibility of a systematic, self-reproducing exchange economy, which the means is inverted into an end, beyond the utility calculations of all social actors. Habermas speaks in the Theory of Communicative Action of, quote, norm-free sociality, end quote, and characterizes market mechanisms as, quote, the non-normative steering of individual decisions not subjectively coordinated, end quote. Whereas in the life world or the institutional framework, a process of norm-regulated social constitution through reciprocal coordination of the orientations for action of those participating occurs, in the subsystem, social constitution is converted into a non-linguistic steering mechanism, whereby the social nexus is constituted by, quote, functionally intermeshing action consequences, end quote. However, these determinations are not substantively connected with the autonomization of the logic of capital, anonymous compulsions, and the reproduction of class relations. On the contrary, Habermas regards the performances rendered by the subsystem of the economy as the fulfillment of, quote, conditions for maintenance of socio-cultural life worlds, end quote. He agrees with the neoclassical view of Parsons, who relates the function of the economic system to, quote, the productive performances of the economy, end quote. Or to express it more clearly, he assists in knitting together the ideology that the economy actually exists to serve people, even in capitalism. While Habermas does point out differences between language and money, he nonetheless conceptualizes money uncritically in the neoclassical mold as a symbol of utility. It is used first of all as a mere medium of exchange, and secondly, of goods, whereby ultimately, third of all, is supposed to, quote, embody measurable amounts of value to which all participants can relate as something objective, end quote. The, quote, generalized value, end quote, of money is supposed to lie in its, quote, utility, end quote, and stands in a connection not further explicated with use, quote, use value, end quote, which Habermas refers to as, quote, real value, end quote. Heiner Gansman rightfully points out the lack of clarity in Habermas's concept of utility and the even more unclear idea of a measure of utility that Habermas presupposes. Habermas does not provide the slightest clue as to how he imagines the measure of utility and what it means that money, quote, symbolizes amounts of value, end quote, measures and preserves value. If, quote, it is not possible to quantify power, end quote, then one wonders why this should be the case with utility. Habermas has nothing more to offer here than discrete neoclassical orthodoxy. He merely asserts with a questionable argument from authority that, quote, economics had already analyzed money, end quote. Habermas also reproduces the neoclassical idealization of exchange as a Habermas also reproduces the neoclassical idealization of exchange as a symmetric occurrence of optimal reciprocal utility maximization. Since he asserts, quote, the exchange relation does not, in its very definition, disadvantage anyone involved in his calculation of utility, and whereas the process of exchange may well be, as we say, in the interest of both parties, end quote. The fact that money literally externalizes the participation in social wealth for social actors, it marks a mediation that presupposes a sharp separation from the object of need, private property, and the exclusion from wealth, is ignored in this context, as is the possibility of crisis which is already given with the existence of money, as well as the inversion of means and end in the economy, which has emancipated itself from all human determination of aims subordinating the human determination of aims. The only thing left by Habermas is a washed-out indication that money is, quote, capable of being invested, end quote. Otherwise, Habermas does not want to, quote, discuss in any detail the system-building effect that the money medium can have under certain evolutionary conditions, end quote. For that, he would also need a concept of capital and class, which he does not provide. On the contrary, he relies unilaterally upon the reduction of the expenditure of interpretive energy and the decrease of the risk of dissent which money supposedly brings about, with which he brings it into the proximity of being a mere technical means of utility maximization, the imperative of which must not be allowed to reach into the areas of the life world in order to be regarded as tolerable. Such infringements or colonization effects, as Habermas characteristically names them, are, however, purely external, hence the colonization metaphor, and, quote, coincidental acts of autonomization, end quote, which are not intrinsically connected with the medium of money. In a later essay, however, Habermas argues that, quote, the switch to media-steered interactions results in an objective inversion of setting goals and choosing means, end quote, for actors, since, quote, the medium itself now transmits the system maintenance imperatives of the system in question, end quote. And such interactions are therefore, quote, no longer embody an instrumental reason located in the purposive rationality of decision makers, but rather a functionalist reason inherent in self-regulating systems, end quote. However, this insight remains abstract. It is not substantialized by Habermas neither in terms of economic theory nor political theory, or does it become... It is not substantialized by Habermas neither in terms of economic theory nor political theory, or does it become at all clear that the content of the term conservation, Bestandserhaltung, means, or what is supposed to be rational about functionalist reason, if here a decoupling of all manner of the rationality of actors occurs. Altogether, we must agree with Gansman when, with regard to Habermas's concept of money, Gansman notes that Habermas, quote, proceeds through astonishingly well-chiseled conceptual models in order to arrive at the conclusion that money is complicated but ultimately a harmless institution, end quote. Labor as, quote, labor, end quote, as model for praxis. Moishe Pastone correctly notes that Habermas's critique of Marx's conception of synthesis through labor is based upon an understanding of labor as concrete labor per se, end quote. However, Marx does not reduce praxis to quote, labor, end quote, but rather, quote, he analyzes how what might be two dimensions of social life in other societies are conflated in capitalism, inasmuch as both are mediated by labor, end quote. That is to say, for Marx, concrete labor always has a social character. He emphasizes that human beings only produce, quote, by cooperating in a certain way and mutually exchanging their activities. Only within these social connections and relations does their relation with nature, does production take place, end quote. However, this is Pastone's point. Concrete labor in pre-capitalist relations is essentially mediated in a normative manner, whereas under capitalist relations they are primarily mediated by abstract labor. So why does Habermas ignore this additional social dimension of labor as abstract labor? A considerable source of the assumption that Marx favors a largely monological concept of labor is undoubtedly the selective reference to different levels of presentation in capital. Habermas's interpretation rips statements by Marx, among others from Chapter 7, out of context and declares them to be Marx's social theoretical foundation as such. What is not taken into consideration is that Marx here consciously constructs the abstraction of the, quote, worker, of, quote, the, end quote, worker, and considers his or her activity in its, quote, simple and abstract elements, end quote, in order to demonstrate that we are dealing with determinations that are peculiar to all human labor processes and that are distinct from the social form that the labor process assumes in capitalism, namely that of being a process of valorizing value. For that reason, Marx can say that it is, quote, not necessary to present the worker in his relationship with other workers. It was enough to present man and his labor on one side, nature and its materials on the other. end quote. To conclude from a conscious methodological abstraction that here certain manifestations of the labor process are absolutely reduced to an isolated artistic form of activity simply means ignoring the level of abstraction of Marx's argument. Dieter Wolff points out the specific character of the level of presentation of the simple labor process, which on one hand consummates an abstraction from all social aspects that affect the genesis and reproduction of human-specific competencies, thought, language, etc., but which on the other hand cannot contain abstractions from the results of these social processes without succumbing to, quote, the instinctive operations of certain animals, end quote. An abstraction is made from the sociality of labor without which thinking and speaking cannot be explained. Nonetheless, after this has occurred, the remaining side of social labor is considered, quote, without falling back into, quote, animalistic, instinctive proto-forms of labor, end quote, end quote. Now, if Habermas refers to, quote, cooperation, end quote, as a, quote, form of social labor, end quote, with which the abstraction of the simple labor process is, quote, always, end quote, connected qua interaction, then according to Wolff, he does not leave the labor process, but proceeds to the labor process that under the influence of the capital relation has, quote, acquired the form of cooperation based upon simple division of labor within a workplace, end quote. With cooperation, one has not grasped the entirety of the sociality of labor, since here the form of social division of labor is ignored in favor of the division of labor within a workplace. And it is precisely the social division of labor that concerns Marx with regard to the synthesizing function of labor as the substance of value and a purely social relation. We have already seen that Habermas wishes to make this market-based social division of labor dependent upon the institutional framework understood in purely juridical terms as, quote, property order, end quote. Whereas cooperation in the capital-determined labor process is supposedly generated by a consciously calculating instrumental rationality. Value and social synthesis qua abstract labor also remain unaddressed here. Naturalistic conception of wealth and empiricist conception of labor. It can be said in summary that Habermas's concept of wealth in his early writings stands in the tradition of a Ricardian interpretation of Marx, Robinson, Sweezy, Dobb, Baran, that had characterized the 50s and 60s. This reduces, based upon a few misunderstood passages in Capital in which naturalistic-sounding characterizations of the source of value as, quote, a productive expenditure of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc., end quote, can in fact be found. The so-called substance of value to a physiological or at least an empirical magnitude. Marx supposedly attempts in his determination of the substance of value to, quote, be realistic, end quote, to discover, quote, something observable and important, end quote, or, quote, a physiological process, a level with a basis in nature, end quote. This naturalistic and primarily quantitatively oriented interpretation of Marx's categories, first of all, ignores the qualitative aspect of the question concerning value and the substance of value, and with regard to the determinants of value, refers back merely to the quantitative dimension of social average labor time. Second, it disregards the intrinsic connection between value and value form as well as money. And third, it behaves with complete indifference towards the structure of dialectical presentation of economic categories. Thus, already in 1960, Habermas assumes a conception of value as a, quote, datum of natural history, end quote, Jesus Christ, and writes of, quote, physical exploitation, end quote. This naturalistically constricted point of view is also the basis of his interpretation of statements by Marx in the Grundrisse as a thesis on machinery being productive of value, Marx, according to Habermas, had understood the transition to automated production in the Grundrisse, quote, in such a way that the production of value would be transformed from directly productive labor to science and technology, end quote. In fact, however, Marx speaks here of the, quote, creation of a real wealth, end quote, in the sense of use values, which becomes less dependent, quote, on labor time and on the amount of labor employed than on the power of the agency set in motion during labor time, end quote. Whereas the capitalist form of wealth remains, as it were, as it was before, dependent upon the, quote, amount of labor employed, end quote, within the framework of the class relation. Within this interpretation of Marx, Habermas is already working with a concept of wealth that confounds the production of use value and the production of value. It is otherwise hard to explain how he understands Marx's theses from the Grundrisse to be a, quote, revisionist notion, end quote. On the other hand, it is consistent since it is not clear why one would attribute value productivity to a, quote, psychophysical magnitude, end quote, called labor and not to another psychophysical magnitude called technology. The logical presentation architecture of capital is just as disregarded by Habermas as the systematic interrelation between value and money. Later, he would switch to adopting the subjective theory of value of neoclassical economics, which is also naturalistic. Alongside this early piece of evidence that Habermas, quote, does not grasp Marx's distinction between value and material wealth, end quote, and misses the genuinely social content of the concept of abstract labor, further evidence can be found from later works. Habermas constantly raises the accusation against Marx that, quote, the theory of value is carried through in action-theoretic concepts that make it necessary to approach the genesis of reification below the level of interaction, end quote, and that, quote, action can be understood only as productive, objectifying activity, end quote. But since, according to Habermas, quote, production constitutes only an object or a content for normative rules, end quote, he is unable to grasp its social dimension. How unspecific Habermas's handling of Marx's categories is also demonstrates by his assertion in the, quote, new obscurity, end quote, that, quote, the classic authors of social theory from Marx through Max Weber were in agreement that the structure of bourgeois society received its form from abstract labor, end quote. However, the notion that Weber formulated a concept of abstract labor that is even close to that of Marx can only be sensibly asserted if, like Habermas, one understands abstract labor to be a special form of concrete labor. In general, Habermas's use of Marx's concepts in his later writing gives an impression of extreme arbitrariness. For example, is, quote, abstract labor power, end quote, what, for example, is, quote, abstract labor power, end quote, supposed to be? Does he mean de-skilled labor power, as Marx still suggests in the introduction to the Grundrisse? But this is also not abstract and never labor sans phrase in the value theoretical sense. Also, his thesis that exchange value is the form of appearance of use value makes no sense within the framework of Marx's theory, and Habermas does not offer an alternative. Finally, the notion that, quote, monetarized labor power, end quote, is referred to by Marx as, quote, abstract labor, end quote, is simply false. The mere fact that labor power and labor are amalgamated here provides evidence for the increasing tendency towards a language game without rules in which Habermas ensnares himself when appropriating Marx's work. Also remaining trapped in a purely empirical concept of labor is Habermas's diagnosis of a, quote, devaluation of the relevance of labor within the life world, end quote. Quote, the production paradigm, end quote, according to Habermas, quote, gives the concept of praxis, gives the concept of practice such a clear empirical meaning that the question arises of whether it loses its plausibility with the historically foreseeable end of a society based upon labor, end quote. This is also the place of the sociological critique of the production paradigm that Habermas hints at with reference to a talk by Klaus Offe from the year 1982. His observations on the structural transformation of labor society definitely calls primitive versions of labor movement Marxism into question. But Offe can only believe that the erosion of the homogeneous milieu of the industrial worker, or the dissolution of continuous biographical trajectories of labor, the rise of new social lines of conflict beyond the wage relation, and the extension of state activity to secure the general conditions of production, affect the level of Marx's analysis of capital, because he reduces the concept of labor of the production paradigm to a particular sort of concrete labor and a specific pattern of the organization of the labor process, namely a specific manifestation of proletarian factory labor that characterized the living conditions under capitalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The, quote, experiences and conflicts engendered by labor, end quote, are what is meant when Offe advances the thesis that, quote, the sphere of production and work quote, the sphere of production and work is losing its capacity to determine the structure and development of the larger society, end quote. That one can note a, quote, differentiation within the concept of work, end quote. He reduces Marx's concept of labor to the sphere of the immediate factory labor process and the dominant forms of, quote, technical organizational productivity, end quote, found there, in order to present the increase of functionally indispensable, primarily state, quote, service work, end quote, as a demolition of Marx's spectrum of concepts. There arises on the basis of, quote, economic strategic criteria of rationality, end quote, a non-normalizable, norm-derived praxis, quote, partially freed from the immediate discipline of an acquisitive social rationality, and from its corresponding achievement and productivity restraints, end quote, which is additionally a source of post-materialist value orientations and a, quote, indispensable foreign body, end quote, in the system of capitalist reproduction. Offe conceives of the form of the social division of labor according to Marx, quote, objective equalization of unequal quantities of labor forcibly brought about by the social process, end quote, as the, quote, subjective equality of the labors of individuals, end quote, or as concrete labor consciously measured temporally according to the criterion of, quote, efficient production, end quote, within the workplace. For that reason, the fact that, quote, quantitative volume, end quote, of state service, surveillance, and reproduction activity, quote, cannot easily be determined, end quote, is what makes it a, quote, foreign body, end quote, and upon which at least Habermas obviously hangs his hopes for emancipation. Summary. On the basis of the few pages at my disposal here, it is impossible in an even remotely adequate way to demonstrate that production and labor, in contrast to Habermas's interpretation, are two-dimensional categories in Marx's work, which very much constitute a form of social unity in capitalism along with the content of normative rules. Thus a few observations will have to suffice. According to Marx, in all modes of production with a division of labor, labor has the role of satisfying social needs, but only under the conditions of a division of labor with private character, which implies systematic relations of exchange, do they obtain the additional social function of constituting a social nexus. Private acts of labor, quote, can only satisfy the manifold needs of the individual producer himself, only insofar as every particular kind of useful private labor can be exchanged with, i.e., counts as the equal of every other kind of useful private labor, end quote. The labor of producers acquires a double character, quote, on the one hand, it is a specific sort of labor that produces particular goods for others, end quote, which characterizes the specific social character of concrete labor. Yet, quote, yet, on the other hand, labor independent of its specific content serves the producer as the means by which the products of others are acquired, end quote. It cannot fulfill this function in its concrete manifestation, but only in its property of being labor sans phrase, as abstract labor. Accordingly, in capitalism, we are dealing with the state of affairs of the social constitution of concrete labor through abstract labor. In all previous modes of production, in contrast, labor and products are, quote, qualitatively particular, end quote, and as such, in their natural form, are socially recognized on the basis of specific types of interaction. Accordingly, material wealth as a result of concrete labor does not constitute a social nexus, according to Marx. However, it is the, quote, social nexus within which people mutually recognize their acts of labor as socially expended, end quote. And in pre-capitalist modes of production, this social nexus precedes such acts of labor, in the Habermasian sense of a, quote, institutional framework of compulsory norms, end quote. The difference between concrete and abstract labor exists in all societies, in the mind of the theoretical observer, as a property of all concrete labor, of human labor as such. But first, in generalized relations of production of a private division of labor, does abstract labor also acquire the function of being the social general form of concrete labor, and thus also the substance of value. According to Marx, it is, quote, something which is only valid for this particular form of production, the production of commodities, namely the fact that the specific social character of private labors carried on independently of each other consist in their equality as human labor, and in the product assumes the form of the existence of value, end quote. Thus an independence is bestowed upon abstract labor which otherwise, quote, only the social nexus distinct from it has, end quote, and concrete and abstract labor are ultimately as distinct as two separate entities. Here I have only been able to indicate that Habermas systematically misses Marx's concept of the double character of labor and lacks categorical access to the value theoretical level of Marx's work. The reified or alienated form of the recognition of concrete labor under conditions of production characterized by a private division of labor which occurs by means of abstract labor falls between the cracks of symbolic interactionism, Ricardian naturalism, and later the system theoretical, neoclassical theoretical apparatus. But for Marx, abstract labor and value are not products of concrete labor in the engagement of human beings with nature. Rather, abstract labor and value stand for the social unity of acts of labor and products under the condition and with the consequence of their systematic dissociation as private acts of labor and products. Commodities only have value objectivity within this specific social relation between things. It is a relational property, since, for Marx, no good is a commodity on its own. Quote, none has such value objectivity on its own. They only possess this social objectivity as a social relationship. End quote. Value is the relation of products of labor as products of human labor as such in the act of exchange, a historically determined form of the mediation of labor, which first in capitalism becomes the general form of social metabolism. Stoffwechsel. Value is objectively mediated. It is represented in things and misrecognized as a natural property of things while being a social relation between private acts of labor. In its objective form of representation, money, it already implies the structurally violent separation of human beings from the objects of their needs, as well as the possibility of crisis, and becomes autonomous as the aim of material reproduction in the form of capital. This objective anonymous form of social constitution, which escapes the control of human beings, is not encompassed by normative relations of technical utilitarian relations to objects. Marx interprets economic objectivity as a historically specific relation without following the reification of economic theory or the differentiation theoretical neutralizations of systems theory. Quote, economy, end quote, is understood by Marx as a society constituted by domination. But Marx does not succumb to a symbolic interactionism that grasps social forms merely as complexes of norms. Economic forms, according to Krause, constitute, quote, neither a relationship between things and subjects, such as in subjective value theory, nor between subjects, such as theories of power or action, end quote. Marx grasps that modern relations of production are not merely objectively veiled interpersonal relations or traceable back to the domination of norms. Quote, the social relationships of their labors, end quote, according to Marx's long-ignored insight, quote, are and appear consequently not as immediately social relationships of persons in their labors, but as objectified relationships of persons or social relationships of objects, end quote. Capital generates a form of anonymous rule whose characteristic is not the subordination of the will of one person under that of another person. This type of domination is not primarily one of, quote, actors being compelled, end quote, but rather one of a, quote, compelled existence, end quote, without this compulsion being one of first nature. According to Marx, capitalism is a social formation that conditions a subordination of the wills and goals of all social actors to the imperative of accumulation that demands, quote, production for production's sake, end quote. It lets, quote, the capitalist from another side appear as much under the bondage of capital as the laborer, end quote. It is therefore a regression behind Marx's insights into the nature of capitalism when Habermas reduces economic domination to the normative assignment of roles and conceives of autonomized forms of wealth, such as money and capital, as neutral forms of social unity. Translated by Alex Locascio.